The caregiver's suspicion. The late afternoon sun bathed little Sprout's daycare in a warm golden hue, casting long shadows across the colorful playground. Inside, laughter and chatter echoed through the hallways as children played, their innocent joy filling the air. Jessica Lane, a 29-year-old caregiver with a sharp instinct for children's well-being, smiled as she watched them interact, her heart swelling with fondness. Jessica had worked at Little Sprouts for nearly 7 years. She had seen all kinds of behavior from children during pickup time, some eager to see their parents, others reluctant to leave their friends behind. But today, something unsettled her. She glanced at the daycare's digital notification board, a recent upgrade that displayed which parents had checked in for pickup. The screen showed Emily Carter was next, her mother already en route. With that knowledge, Jessica made her way toward the playground to find Emily and help her get ready. The moment she spotted the little girl, however, her stomach twisted. Emily Carter, a 5-year-old with bright blue eyes and soft brown curls, stood apart from the others. Instead of playing, she was sitting under the slide, hugging her knees to her chest. It was unusual. Emily was one of the most social children in the daycare, always at the center of games and stories. Jessica approached gently, crouching down to the child's level. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "Your mommy is almost here. It's time to pack up." Emily's head snapped up. Her eyes, usually filled with excitement, were rimmed with unused tears. Instead of smiling, she pressed herself deeper into the small hiding spot under the slide. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Jessica's heart squeezed at the response. "Sweetheart, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soothing but firm. Emily's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to go home," she admitted in a tiny voice. "Please, Miss Jessica, can I stay here?" Jessica frowned, concern deepening in her chest. It wasn't uncommon for children to throw small tantrums about leaving, especially if they were having fun. But this felt different. Emily wasn't just pouting or begging for more playtime. She looked truly afraid. Jessica reached out carefully, offering her hand. "Emily, sweetheart, can you tell me why you don't want to go home?" Emily hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "It's not safe there." A chill ran down Jessica's spine. She knew better than to overreact, but she also knew that children often spoke the truth in ways adults brushed off too easily. Keeping her voice steady, she asked, "What do you mean, honey? Did something happen at home?" Before Emily could answer, the electronic chime of the daycare's security system signaled a guardian's arrival. Jessica glanced toward the front desk, expecting to see Emily's mother. But when she turned back to the child, Emily was trembling. No, she whimpered. "Please don't make me go." Jessica's stomach twisted as she stood up. Something was very wrong. She forced a reassuring smile. "Okay, sweetheart. Stay right here for a moment, okay? I'll be right back." With a final glance at the terrified child, Jessica strode toward the front desk. But instead of Emily's mother, a man stood there, and Jessica's gut instantly told her something was off. Jessica slowed her steps as she approached the front desk, keeping her expression neutral while quickly assessing the man standing there. He was tall, with short, dark hair, wearing a crisp button-up shirt and slacks. He looked like any ordinary professional father coming to pick up his child after work, but something about him made Jessica uneasy. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still, too stiff. Or maybe it was the way his fingers tapped subtly against the desk, like someone masking impatience with forced politeness. Jessica cleared her throat as she reached the front desk. "Hello, sir. How can I help you?" The man turned toward her, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm here to pick up Emily Carter." Jessica's unease deepened. She didn't recognize him. But that wasn't unheard of. Sometimes extended family members, or even friends, picked up children when parents were running late. Still, daycare policy was strict. No child was released to an unapproved guardian without explicit confirmation. She kept her tone polite but professional. "Do you have an ID, sir? I just need to verify that you're listed as an authorized guardian for Emily." The man's smile didn't falter, but Jessica noticed a subtle tension in his jaw. "Oh, sure. Of course." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a driver's license, handing it over. Jessica glanced at the name. Mark Carter. Her stomach clenched. Emily's father. That wasn't unusual, except she knew Emily's parents were separated. Emily's mother, Melaine Carter, had always been the one to pick her up, and she had never mentioned Mark being part of the pickup list. Jessica turned toward the security tablet at the desk and tapped Emily's profile. The authorized guardian list confirmed what she feared. Only Melaine Carter was registered for pickups. Jessica looked up again, her voice careful. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Emily's mother is the only one listed as an authorized pickup guardian. Without her explicit permission, I can't release Emily to you." Mark's smile thinned. His fingers curled slightly against the desk. "I understand the policy," he said smoothly. "But Melaine had an emergency and asked me to pick Emily up today. She probably forgot to update the list." Jessica forced a polite nod, but her instincts were screaming. It was possible Melaine had forgotten to update the list, but after what she had just witnessed from Emily, her fear, her reluctance, her pleading, Jessica wasn't willing to take any chances. "Would you mind if I just give Melaine a quick call to confirm?" she asked. Mark's friendly demeanor barely flickered, but Jessica caught the slight tightening of his grip on the counter. "I'd rather not bother her right now," he said, a slight edge creeping into his voice. "She's in the middle of something important. Look, I even brought her phone with me." He pulled a phone from his pocket and held it up. Jessica's stomach twisted. Why does he have Melaine's phone? She kept her face neutral as she took the phone from him, quickly checking the screen. It was unlocked and displayed the Daycare app. Melaine's account was logged in. Everything looked right. But it didn't feel right. Jessica hesitated for just a second before handing the phone back. She needed to stall, just for a moment. "All right, let me just confirm your identity in the system," she said, turning to the desk computer. She needed to think. Mark exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated but maintaining his polite front. Jessica's hands hovered over the keyboard as she glanced back toward the playground. Emily was still under the slide, peeking toward the front desk, her little face pale and anxious. She doesn't want to go with him. Jessica's heart pounded. What do I do? Her training told her she couldn't release a child to an unauthorized guardian, but Mark had Melaine's phone. That would hold up under any surface-level scrutiny. If she kept stalling, he might push harder. She was running out of time. She made a decision. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, "we actually have a new two-step verification process in place for security. It'll just take a minute. Let me print out a form for you to sign." Mark exhaled sharply, barely masking his irritation. But before he could protest, she turned and walked toward the admin office at the back. As soon as she was out of sight, she pulled out her own phone and quickly dialed Melaine Carter. The call went straight to voicemail. Her phone is in Mark's hands. Of course she won't answer. Jessica's pulse raced as she debated what to do next. She glanced down the hallway toward Emily, who was now shaking under the slide, her tiny fingers gripping the wooden frame. Jessica couldn't let this go. She tapped the daycare's emergency contact number and called again. This time, someone picked up. "Hello." A woman's voice answered, breathless and rushed. Jessica inhaled sharply. "Melaine." "This is Jessica from Little Sprouts." A pause. Then panic. "Jessica." Jessica could hear background noise, shuffling, muffled voices, fear. "Melaine, is everything okay?" Jessica asked, her grip tightening on the phone. Another pause. Then a whisper. No, it's not." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. I can't talk right now," Melaine said, voice shaking. "But do not let Mark take Emily. Please." That was all Jessica needed to hear. She immediately hung up and marched back toward the front desk, her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear over the sound of her own pulse. As she approached, she found Mark leaning on the counter, his smile now replaced with barely concealed irritation. "Everything good?" he asked. Jessica plastered on a calm expression. "Unfortunately, there's been a mix-up with the system, and we won't be able to release Emily today without a direct confirmation from her mother." Mark's jaw tensed. "I just told you." "I understand, sir," Jessica interrupted, keeping her voice professional but firm. "But our policy is strict. If you have any concerns, you're welcome to wait here until I can get direct confirmation." Mark's nostrils flared slightly. He knew what she was doing. Jessica kept her stance neutral, bracing herself for whatever he might say next. Finally, after a long, tense silence, he exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. "I'll call Malign myself." He turned away, yanking out the phone. Jessica didn't move, keeping her posture composed even as dread curled in her stomach. She glanced back toward the playground. Emily was still watching. Her wide, terrified eyes met Jessica's. And in that moment, Jessica made a silent promise. "I won't let him take you. Not today. Not ever." The confrontation at pickup. Jessica Lane stood her ground, her hands clasped in front of her, as Mark Carter stepped away from the counter, his phone pressed to his ear. Her heart pounded. She had no idea how this was going to play out, but she knew one thing. She wasn't letting Emily leave with him. Mark's face darkened as he listened to the call ring. Malign wouldn't answer. Jessica had made sure of that. But she didn't know how long she could stall before Mark lost his patience. Taking a deep breath, she subtly glanced toward the play area. Emily was still hiding under the slide, her small hands gripping the wooden edges so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. Jessica's stomach twisted. "What are you so afraid of, sweetheart? What has he done?" She looked back at Mark. His free hand twitched slightly, his fingers flexing, a subtle sign of agitation. He was trying to keep his cool, but Jessica could tell it was slipping. Finally, he pulled the phone away from his ear and sighed in exasperation. "She's not answering," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Probably busy." Jessica didn't blink. "That's all right, sir. We'll just wait until she calls back." Mark clenched his jaw, his patience clearly running out. "Look, I don't know why you're making this so difficult," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I am Emily's father. I have a legal right to pick up my own daughter." Jessica held her ground. "I understand, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice remaining polite yet firm. "But daycare policy is strict. I can't release a child unless the listed guardian personally confirms it." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew she wasn't going to budge. For the first time, real anger flickered across his face. His body tensed, his fingers tapping against the counter again. Too fast, too sharp. Jessica felt the shift in the air. He's dangerous. But before he could say another word, a new voice interrupted. "Hey, everything okay over here?" Jessica turned, relieved to see David Palmer, one of the daycare's security consultants, standing nearby. He was a former military officer, now working at Little Sprouts to oversee security measures. Mark tensed immediately. He hadn't expected another person to get involved. David looked at Jessica for confirmation, his sharp eyes flicking between her and Mark. She gave him the slightest nod. David didn't need more than that. He crossed his arms, planting himself between Mark and the hallway leading to the playroom. "We've got strict policies on pickups," David said, his tone neutral but firm. "We have to follow protocol, for Emily's safety. I'm sure you understand." Mark's lips thinned. He wasn't used to being challenged. For a tense moment, nobody moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken threats. Then Mark exhaled sharply, forcing a smile. "Of course," he said smoothly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his frustration. "I'll just wait then." Jessica let out a silent breath. But she knew he wasn't giving up. Emily's escape attempt Mark had taken a seat in the waiting area, tapping his foot impatiently while scrolling on his phone. He was waiting for something. Jessica didn't trust it. She turned and made her way back toward the play area, her pulse still racing from the confrontation. The moment she stepped inside, Emily bolted toward her. Jessica crouched down just in time to catch the trembling girl. "Miss Jessica," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't let him take me." Jessica's chest tightened. She brushed a few curls from Emily's face and whispered, "You're safe, sweetheart. I promise." Emily's little fingers dug into Jessica's shirt, clutching the fabric like a lifeline. Jessica knew she couldn't ask too many questions now. Emily was terrified. Pressuring her would only make it worse. But one thing was clear: Emily wasn't going to go willingly. Jessica pulled back slightly, giving Emily a reassuring look. "Sweetheart, can you do something for me?" Emily nodded quickly. "I want you to go sit in the reading corner, okay? Just stay there until I come back." Emily hesitated, glancing toward the front desk, where Mark was still seated. But she nodded, her little hands shaking as she made her way toward the reading nook. Jessica stood, her mind racing. This wasn't normal. She needed help. She walked straight toward Ms. Lorraine, the daycare's director, who was reviewing paperwork in the office. "Jessica." Lorraine looked up. "Something wrong." Jessica closed the door behind her. "We have a situation," she said, keeping her voice low but urgent. Lorraine's eyebrows pulled together in concern. "What kind of situation?" Jessica inhaled sharply. "Mark Carter is here, claiming Meline sent him to pick up Emily. But she didn't. And I just spoke to Meline. She told me not to let him take Emily." Lorraine immediately straightened. "Are you saying this could be a custody issue?" Jessica nodded. "Something's not right. Emily is terrified of him." Lorraine didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed Meline's emergency contact number. It went straight to voicemail. Lorraine's face darkened. "We can't take any chances. Call the police." Jessica's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" Lorraine's gaze was hard. "If there's even a chance Emily is in danger, we're not waiting for something to happen." Jessica didn't argue. She immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The moment the dispatcher answered, Jessica spoke quickly. "This is Jessica Lane from Little Sprouts Daycare. We have a potential custodial kidnapping situation. The child's legal guardian has explicitly stated that she does not want her child released to the father, but he's here, and he's refusing to leave." The dispatcher's tone immediately shifted. "Stay on the line. Officers are being dispatched to your location now. Can you confirm the father's name?" Jessica kept her eyes locked on Mark, who was still seated, his jaw clenched as he checked his phone. "His name is Mark Carter. The child is Emily Carter, 5 years old." "Understood. Officers are en route." Jessica hung up and exhaled. Now, all she had to do was stall. Mark's breaking point. Jessica returned to the front desk just as Mark stood up. His face was tense, his patience clearly gone. "She's taking too long," he snapped. "This is ridiculous." Jessica forced a calm tone. "I understand, sir, but I can't release Emily until I have confirmation." Mark's eye twitched. And then he moved. Fast. Too fast. He turned toward the hallway, heading straight for the playroom. Jessica's heart stopped. David immediately blocked his path. "You can't go in there, sir." Mark's mask cracked. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and for the first time, his fury was undeniable. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. "You think you can keep me from my daughter?" David didn't flinch. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to take a step back." Mark's nostrils flared. His entire body was coiled with tension. And then, the sound of sirens filled the air. Mark's head snapped toward the front door. Police cars pulled into the parking lot. Jessica exhaled sharply. She turned just in time to see Emily peek out from the playroom. When the little girl saw the flashing lights, Her entire body sagged with relief. Jessica felt it too. Mark wasn't taking her. Not today. Not ever. The unveiling of the truth. The flashing blue and red lights bathed Little Sprouts Daycare in eerie, pulsating shadows. Jessica Lane stood frozen as 3 police officers stepped out of their patrol cars, their faces serious and their hands resting near their holsters. Mark Carter, who had just been trying to force his way into the playroom, stopped in his tracks, his entire body tensed. Jessica could see it, the quick, darting movement of his eyes as he took in his surroundings. The officers, the locked doors, the witnesses. He was trapped. One of the officers, Sergeant Matthew Briggs, approached the front entrance first. He was tall and broad-shouldered, exuding an air of authority that demanded obedience. His sharp gaze landed on Mark before sweeping over the scene. "Sir, I need you to step away from the daycare entrance," Briggs said firmly. Mark exhaled sharply, forcing a tight-lipped smile as he raised his hand slightly. "Officer, there's been a huge misunderstanding," he said, his voice dripping with fake patience. "I'm just here to pick up my daughter. These people," he gestured toward Jessica and David, "are making things way more difficult than they need to be." Jessica braced herself. She knew men like Mark, the ones who could charm their way out of anything if you let them talk long enough. She wouldn't let that happen. "Sir, we'd received a call regarding a potential custodial dispute," Officer Briggs continued. "We need to confirm some details before anything else happens." Mark clenched his jaw, his mask slipping just a little. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. David, still standing between Mark and the hallway, didn't move an inch. He wasn't going to let Mark anywhere near Emily. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped forward, hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Officers," she said, keeping her voice clear and professional. "I spoke with Emily's mother, Melaine Carter. She specifically told me not to let Emily leave with him. And before I called her, Emily herself told me she didn't want to go home with her father. She was terrified." Mark let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, come on. She's a kid. Kids throw tantrums all the time." Sergeant Briggs held up a hand, silencing him immediately. "Mr. Carter, do you currently have full legal custody of Emily?" Mark hesitated, a little too long. Then he forced a smile. "I share custody with her mother." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. That wasn't what the daycare records showed. Sergeant Briggs didn't react outwardly, but his eyes hardened. "We'll need to verify that with legal documentation. Do you have a copy of your custody agreement on hand?" Mark's jaw twitched. "I don't carry it around," he muttered. Briggs gave a slow nod. "All right, we'll confirm with the child's mother." He turned to the other 2 officers. "Find a direct line to Melaine Carter." Now, Jessica felt a flicker of relief. Melaine would confirm everything. But Mark knew it too. His patience snapped like a frayed wire. "This is bullshit," he hissed. His fingers curled into fists, his entire body vibrating with barely contained rage. "You're all treating me like some kind of criminal. I'm her father. That should be enough." Sergeant Briggs remained unmoved. "Calm down, sir. Yelling won't change our process." Mark gritted his teeth. Jessica didn't blink. She could see it. The moment the realization hit him, he wasn't going to get Emily. Not today. Not ever. A mother's desperate call. Just as one of the officers was about to radio dispatch, Jessica's phone rang. She grabbed it immediately and saw the name flashing across the screen. Melaine Carter. "Jessica?" Melaine's voice was frantic, breathless. "Is Emily okay?" Jessica felt the weight of everything settle deep in her chest. "She's safe," she assured quickly. "We're at the daycare, but Mark tried to take her." Melaine let out a sound, a sharp, shaky exhale that sounded too much like someone barely holding back tears. Jessica stepped away from the confrontation at the front desk and lowered her voice. "Melaine, the police are here. They need confirmation of custody arrangements. Can you tell me right now, Does Mark have shared custody? The pause was enough of an answer. Then Naline's voice came through, thick with emotion. No, she whispered. He lost custody 2 months ago. Jessica's breath hitched. 2 months ago. Jessica's mind raced. Why hadn't Mark's access to Emily been removed from the daycare system? Had Maline been too afraid to come forward? Before she could ask, Maline continued. I have a full restraining order against him, she said, her voice shaking now. He's not even supposed to be within 500 feet of Emily. Jessica's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a custody dispute. This was kidnapping. The moment of reckoning. Jessica turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Sergeant Briggs. Maline just confirmed. Mark lost custody 2 months ago. He has a restraining order against him. Briggs' expression darkened instantly. He turned back to Mark. Sir, you are under arrest for violating a restraining order and attempting to unlawfully remove a child from custody. Mark's face drained of color. What? No, this is a lie. The officers didn't give him a chance to argue. Before he could react, one of them grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs locking into place echoed through the room. Mark snapped. He thrashed violently, nearly knocking over a chair. You can't do this to me, he roared. She's my daughter. Jessica flinched at the sheer fury in his voice. But David stepped beside her, a solid presence, and she felt safe. Mark kept struggling until the officers forced him down onto his knees. His chest was heaving. His face was red with rage. His eyes locked onto Jessica, burning with something ugly and dangerous. You, he spat. Jessica's blood ran cold. You think you're a hero? Mark sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You have no idea what you just did. Jessica clenched her jaw. Yes, I do, she said, her voice steady. I kept Emily safe. Mark's lips curled into a sneer. But before he could say another word, the officers hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the exit. Jessica exhaled shakily. It was over. It was finally over. Emily's safe haven. Jessica turned back toward the playroom. Emily was still crouched in the reading corner, clutching her stuffed animal so tightly that her tiny fingers were turning white. Jessica kneeled down. Sweetheart, she whispered gently. Emily looked up. The moment her eyes met Jessica's, her little face crumpled. She threw herself into Jessica's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Jessica held her tightly, rocking her gently. It's okay, sweetheart, she whispered into Emily's soft curls. He's gone. You're safe now. Emily buried her face into Jessica's shoulder, and for the first time that day, Jessica allowed herself to breathe. The secrets that unraveled. The weight of the night. Jessica Lane sat on the edge of a chair in the dimly lit police station, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m., but time felt meaningless after the evening's chaos. Across from her, Melanie Carter sat on a hard plastic chair, her face still swollen from bruises that hadn't even begun to heal properly. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped from a styrofoam cup of water, her fingers twitching every few moments, as if she still expected Mark to burst through the door. Emily was asleep in another room, curled up on a small couch under a borrowed police blanket. The sight had nearly shattered Jessica's heart. How a child could find peace in a police station after everything she'd been through. Sergeant Briggs leaned forward from behind his desk, his eyes scanning the file in front of him. We ran Mark Carter's background check, he said finally, his voice grave. And I think you both need to hear what we found. Jessica inhaled sharply. She had known that something was terribly wrong with Mark. But she hadn't expected this. Meline barely reacted. She just sat there, staring at her hands, as if she had already braced herself for what was coming. Briggs sighed and flipped through a few pages. Mark lost custody of Emily exactly 67 days ago. But before that, he had partial custody. The case went to trial, and the judge ruled in Meline's favor, full custody, with a restraining order. Jessica swallowed hard. Why? Briggs' lips pressed into a tight line. Because Mark wasn't just a danger to Meline. He was a danger to Emily. Jessica felt her stomach lurch. She turned to Meline, whose hands were now trembling even harder. "Meline?" she asked gently. Meline took in a slow, shaky breath and finally lifted her gaze. "I tried to keep it quiet," she whispered. "I didn't want people to know. I didn't want to believe it myself." She swallowed. But Mark was changing. Jessica leaned in, listening intently. At first, he was a good dad. He was gentle with Emily, patient, even playful. But after he lost his job last year, everything spiraled. He became obsessed with this idea that Emily needed to be stronger. Meline's voice cracked. He started making her do things, little things at first. He'd take her into the woods near our house and tell her she needed to toughen up. He'd make her stay out there alone for hours, refusing to let her back inside until she proved she was brave enough. Jessica's blood ran cold. "Oh my God," she whispered. Meline squeezed her eyes shut. It got worse. She exhaled sharply, as if forcing herself to relive the memories. One night, Emily had a nightmare. She came into our room crying, like any kid would. But instead of comforting her, Mark dragged her outside. Jessica felt the air leave her lungs. Meline's hands clenched into fists. It was freezing. She was barefoot. He left her on the back porch and told her she needed to face her fears. I didn't even know what was happening until I heard her sobbing outside. When I ran out, she was curled into a ball, shivering, her little lips blue. Jessica clenched her jaw to stop herself from breaking down. Meline let out a bitter laugh. "And you know what he said to me? He said, she has to learn sometime. The world isn't kind to weak little girls." Silence filled the room. Sergeant Briggs exhaled. That was the incident that made Meline file for sole custody. The judge saw the psychological evaluation and deemed Mark a danger to his daughter. Jessica turned her head slowly toward the window where Emily was sleeping peacefully. She was just a little girl. "He was conditioning her," Jessica murmured, her hands tightening into fists, "trying to make her afraid of the world." "But why?" Meline shuddered. "Because he thought I was too soft. He believed that if Emily grew up like me, kind, gentle, trusting, she'd end up being used and weak. He thought he was doing her a favor by toughening her up." Jessica felt a sickness coil in her stomach. This wasn't just anger issues or custody disputes. Mark had been systematically breaking down his own daughter's sense of security. And worse, he hadn't stopped. The plan to take Emily. Sergeant Briggs sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We also recovered Mark's laptop from his car." Jessica felt her breath catch. "What did you find?" Briggs exchanged a grim look with the officer beside him before flipping to another page in his file. He had flight itineraries saved. Meline's head snapped up. "What?" Briggs nodded. "Tickets for two, Mark Carter and Emily Carter. Flight scheduled for tomorrow morning at 6:00 a.m. Destination, Canada." Jessica's stomach dropped like a stone. "Oh my God," she whispered. Briggs continued. "But it gets worse. We found an encrypted folder on his computer labeled Re-Education Plan. We're still working on unlocking it, but our tech team already found references to what looks like an abandoned cabin in the mountains." Jessica felt ice flood her veins. He wasn't just taking Emily. He was going to disappear with her. Meline started shaking. "I almost lost her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jessica reached out, squeezing Meline's hands. "You didn't," she said firmly. "Because you fought. Because Emily fought. Because we all fought." The aftermath. Hours later, the storm finally started to settle. Mark Carter was formally charged with child endangerment, violation of a restraining order, and attempted parental abduction. His travel plans and encrypted documents would serve as irrefutable evidence against him. And most importantly, he would never be able to hurt Emily again. As dawn began creeping over the horizon, Jessica walked outside the station, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Melaine followed, holding a still sleeping Emily in her arms. For a moment, they just stood there in the quiet. Then Melaine turned to Jessica. "I don't have the words to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't trusted your gut, if you hadn't followed them that night." She swallowed hard. "I don't know where my daughter would be right now." Jessica felt her eyes sting. She looked down at Emily. Her little fingers curled into the fabric of her mother's shirt, safe and warm. She reached out and gently brushed a curl from the child's face. "You don't have to thank me," Jessica whispered. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Melaine gave a watery smile. "You're a hero, you know that." Jessica let out a small laugh, though tears blurred her vision. "I don't feel like one," she admitted. "I just did what was right." Melaine squeezed her arm. "That's what makes you one." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jessica believed it. Because in a world filled with darkness, she had chosen to listen. And that choice had saved a life. The trial of shadows. 6 months later, the courtroom was eerily silent. The air inside was thick with tension, pressing down like an invisible weight on everyone present. Jessica Lane sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Beside her, Melaine Carter's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for a tissue, dabbing at the corner of her eye. Jessica glanced over at the woman who had become both a survivor and a warrior in the last few months. The bruises on her face had long since faded, but the emotional scars ran deeper. Across the courtroom, Mark Carter sat stiffly in his chair, his expression cold and unreadable. His once pristine suit was now wrinkled, his posture slightly slumped, yet his eyes, those dark, calculating eyes, were still full of malice. Jessica had hoped that after his arrest, he would have broken down, shown remorse, but he never did. Not once. And that terrified her more than anything else. The unveiling of the truth. The judge entered, and everyone in the room stood. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing through the high ceilings. Jessica inhaled sharply, her heart pounding as she looked toward the jury. This was it. The moment of reckoning. As soon as the judge took his seat, the prosecution began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor, Elaine Wilkes, began, her voice steady and strong. "We are here today to ensure justice is served. We are here because Mark Carter was caught attempting to abduct his own daughter, violating a legal restraining order, and planning to disappear with her to an unknown location." Jessica watched as Wilkes turned toward the jury, her expression grave. "But this case isn't just about an abduction. It's about a pattern of abuse. A man who spent years systematically breaking down his family. A man who didn't just try to kidnap Emily Carter. He tried to erase her mother from her life entirely." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Mark remained eerily still. Jessica couldn't help but steal a glance at him. He was listening. For the first time, he looked nervous. Wilkes continued, her words sharp and unrelenting. This was not a desperate father trying to see his daughter. This was a calculated, premeditated crime. And today we will prove that Mark Carter is not just a dangerous man. He is an unfit father, a threat to his own child, and a manipulative abuser. Jessica felt her hands tremble slightly as the prosecutor's words cut through the courtroom like a blade. She knew everything Wilkes was saying was true. She had seen it. She had felt it in her bones the moment she saw Emily trembling under that slide at the daycare. And now, the world was finally hearing the truth. The evidence that shook the courtroom. As the trial progressed, the prosecution unveiled the damning evidence against Mark. The flight tickets to Canada, proving his plan to disappear. The encrypted folder labeled Re-Education Plan that contained notes about isolating Emily in a remote location. The restraining order violation. Evidence that Mark had no legal right to even be near his daughter. Jessica's testimony, describing the night at the daycare, Emily's fear, and how Mark had tried to forcefully take her. Meline's harrowing account of the psychological and emotional abuse she and Emily had endured. But the most heartbreaking piece of evidence came when the courtroom played a recording of Emily's own words, captured the night she was rescued. Jessica had been there when it was recorded. Sitting in that small, sterile police station, Emily had spoken in a tiny, broken voice. "Daddy told me that if I told Mommy, he'd make me disappear. He said I wasn't a baby anymore, that I had to learn how to survive. I just wanted to go home with Mommy, but Daddy said I didn't have a choice." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Jessica glanced at Meline, who had covered her mouth with her hand, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Jessica swallowed hard. And for the first time since the trial had started, Mark's expression changed. His confidence cracked. For a brief second, Jessica saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it regret? Fear? Or was it simply the rage of a man who had lost control? Mark Carter's defense. A web of lies. Mark's attorney, Jacob Reeves, was smooth, calculated, and charismatic. He twisted the narrative, painting Mark as a loving father who had been wrongfully alienated from his daughter. "This is a case of parental alienation," Reeves argued. Meline Carter poisoned their daughter against Mark. She manipulated the legal system to remove his parental rights, and when he tried to see his own child, they treated him like a criminal. Jessica's blood boiled. She knew what Mark had done. She had seen Emily shrink in terror at the mere sight of him. But Reeves was good. His words sowed doubt into the courtroom. Mark even shed a few fake tears, claiming he never wanted to hurt Emily. It was disgusting. But the prosecution had one final weapon, and it was about to destroy Mark's defense completely. The witness that changed everything. The courtroom doors opened. A new witness was led to the stand. Jessica turned her head, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Dr. Susan Harper, a child psychologist who had spent weeks evaluating Emily. Mark's face drained of color. Dr. Harper sat down, her expression calm yet commanding. "Dr. Harper," Wilkes began, "can you tell us what you learned from your psychological assessment of Emily Carter?" Harper nodded. "Emily Carter exhibits severe symptoms of PTSD consistent with chronic emotional abuse." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's heart pounded. Harper continued. She described feeling unsafe with her father. She recounted multiple instances where he forced her into distressing situations under the guise of making her stronger. Harper turned toward Mark. This was not parenting. This was psychological manipulation. This was abuse. Mark's jaw tightened. His attorney shifted uncomfortably. The jury members were writing rapidly in their notepads. Jessica's chest tightened. This was it. The moment the scales tipped. The moment Mark lost everything. The verdict. 2 days later, the jury delivered their verdict. The room was so silent that Jessica could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Carter, guilty on all counts." Jessica felt the breath leave her lungs. Beside her, Meline sobbed openly. Mark stared straight ahead, unblinking. And just like that, it was over. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no chance of parole for at least 15 years. He wouldn't see Emily again. Not now. Not ever. Moving forward. That night, as Jessica sat with Meline and Emily at their new apartment, the world felt lighter. Emily giggled as she played with her stuffed animal, safe and warm. Meline poured Jessica a cup of tea, her smile tired but genuine. "You saved us," Meline whispered. Jessica shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Emily saved herself. I just made sure someone listened." Healing and new beginnings. 1 year later, the air smelled of freshly baked cookies and cinnamon as Jessica Lane stepped into Meline Carter's new home. The cozy 2-bedroom townhouse was bathed in soft afternoon light, the walls decorated with pastel paintings and family photos that hadn't existed a year ago. It was a home filled with warmth, a place that finally felt safe. Jessica carefully set a bag of groceries on the kitchen counter, brushing her hands against her jeans before looking around. The sound of light laughter echoed from the living room, and she peeked inside. There, curled up on the couch with a coloring book and a stuffed animal tucked under her arm, was Emily Carter. She looked different now. Not physically. She still had those same soft brown curls and bright blue eyes. But there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before. No more shrunken shoulders. No more fearful glances over her shoulder. She was healing, and that was a miracle in itself. Jessica smiled as she stepped forward. "Hey, kiddo," she said warmly. Emily looked up and grinned. Jessica's heart swelled. "Miss Jessica." Emily scrambled off the couch and ran straight into her arms, wrapping her small hands around Jessica's waist. Jessica knelt down, hugging her tightly. "Wow," she teased. "That's the strongest hug I've ever gotten." Emily giggled, pulling back. "Mom says I'm getting stronger every day." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. "You sure are, sweetheart." A year ago, Emily had been scared of the world. Afraid of shadows, afraid of the past. But today, she was just a happy little girl again. The weight of the past. As Jessica sat down on the couch, Emily climbed up beside her, flipping through her coloring book. Meline appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Sorry about the mess," she said sheepishly. "I was trying to bake cookies, but Emily insisted we make them into dinosaur shapes." Jessica chuckled. "Sounds like a solid artistic choice." Meline sighed dramatically. "You say that now, but wait until you see my T-Rex-shaped disaster in the kitchen." Emily giggled, kicking her legs happily. Jessica leaned back against the couch, feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. For months after the trial, it had been hard. Emily had spent weeks in therapy, learning how to trust again. Meline had struggled with nightmares, waking up gasping for breath, convinced Mark was somehow still lurking in the shadows. And Jessica had wondered if she had done enough. Had she stepped in soon enough? Had she truly saved them? But looking at Emily now, seeing her laugh, seeing Meline's eyes filled with joy instead of fear, Jessica knew the answer. Yes, she had done enough. And she'd do it all over again if she had to. The letter that changed everything. Just as Jessica was about to grab a cookie from the plate on the coffee table, Meline cleared her throat. "There's something I wanted to show you," she said softly. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious." Meline gave her a small smile and reached into a drawer, pulling out a sealed envelope. She handed it to Jessica with slightly shaking hands. Jessica frowned but took the envelope, flipping it over. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the sender's name. Mark Carter. Jessica's entire body tensed. Her first instinct was to tear the letter in half. Burn it. Erase it. But then she saw Meline's face. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just acceptance. "I got it last month," Meline said quietly. "It's from prison." He wanted to send one last message before they moved him to another facility. Jessica swallowed hard and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. "Jessica Lane, you ruined my life. You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't understand the world like I do. You don't know what it takes to survive. You don't know what it means to be strong. You took everything from me." Jessica felt her fingers tremble as she read. But she kept going. "I will never forget what you did. But I want you to remember this too. One day, Emily will grow up. She'll learn the truth. She'll know that you turned her against her own father. And when that day comes, when she realizes what you did, I hope you feel what I feel right now." Jessica exhaled slowly and folded the letter. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there, absorbing the weight of it. Then she laughed. A quiet, almost amused chuckle. Meline's eyebrows shot up. "You're laughing." Jessica shook her head, tossing the letter onto the coffee table. He still thinks he has control, she said. That's what this is. One last pathetic attempt to hold on to power. Meline blinked. Then, slowly, she smiled. Jessica leaned forward, meeting Meline's gaze. Emily isn't going to grow up and learn the truth. She already knows the truth. She knows that she's loved, that she's safe, that she's free. Meline exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. And Emily didn't even care about the letter. She was too busy coloring a rainbow. Jessica reached out and ruffled the girl's hair. Do you want to know what I think, Meline? She said lightly. Meline nodded. What's that? Jessica smirked. I think we should use that letter to light a bonfire. Meline laughed, shaking her head. I like the way you think. Emily looked up, curious. What's a bonfire? Jessica winked at her. A place where we send bad memories to never come back. Emily beamed. I want to do that. Jessica and Meline exchanged a knowing look. And in that moment, the past lost its power. A new beginning. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica, Meline, and Emily stood in the backyard. A small fire crackled in the fire pit, flickering against the darkening sky. Jessica held up Mark's letter. With no hesitation, she tossed it into the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the words turning to ashes in the wind. Emily watched, her small hands clasped together. Then she turned to Jessica and asked, Is it gone now? Jessica smiled. Yes, sweetheart, she said. It's gone. Emily grinned. Good. And just like that, they let it go. The past, the pain, the shadows, all burned away in the fire, and in its place, they found something new. Hope, freedom, family, a fresh start. And this time, no one was ever taking it away.